The boyfriend I borrowed for Christmas. Point 1. The lie. I invited Julian on my family trip because lying for 4 days seemed easier than answering one more question about why I was still single. I expected him to play the part, charm my relatives, and laugh about it with me afterward. I did not expect pretending to love him to feel more honest than anything I had done in years. The lie began on a Tuesday afternoon between a meeting about toothpaste and an argument over whether a smiling cartoon molar looked trustworthy. I was a copywriter at a mid-sized advertising agency in Philadelphia, which meant I spent an unreasonable amount of my adult life discussing words no normal person would ever notice. Julian was the art director assigned to the same dental care campaign. He sat across the conference table from me, turning his pen between his fingers while our creative director tried to explain why the molar needed more emotional authority. Julian caught my eye. Without changing his expression, he made the cartoon tooth on his notepad salute. I looked down before I laughed. That was Julian's particular talent. He never fought to become the center of a room, yet somehow the room became easier when he was in it. He remembered the receptionist's birthday. He brought an extra coffee to meetings without making anyone feel they owed him one. When a junior designer made a mistake, he corrected the file before he corrected the person. He was also unfairly handsome, but I had worked hard to classify that as irrelevant professional information. At 29, I had already learned that attraction was not a plan. My last serious boyfriend, Andrew, and I had spent 3 years building a relationship that looked stable from the outside and felt like a performance review from the inside. By the end, I had started apologizing before asking simple questions. When he moved out, he told me I needed too much reassurance. I responded by pretending I needed none. That strategy had worked beautifully if the goal was to eat dinner over the sink and avoid every man who held eye contact for longer than 2 seconds. My phone vibrated during the meeting. My younger sister Natalie had sent 7 messages to the family group chat. Mom needs final numbers for Grandma's birthday weekend. Also, she wants to know if Alex is bringing someone. Not subtle, Mom. I turned the phone face down. It vibrated again. You said there was someone from work? I had said that 3 months earlier during a Sunday video call, after my mother asked whether I was putting myself out there, and my Aunt Louise suggested a divorced orthodontist she had met at the grocery store. I had been tired. Julian had appeared behind me on the call to return a notebook, and Natalie had immediately asked who he was. Someone from work, I had said. My mother had noticed the way I smiled after he left. She asked whether he was only someone from work. We'll see, I had answered, because apparently I enjoyed creating problems for my future self. Now my grandmother was turning 75 at Cedar Ridge, the mountain town where my family rented the same old lodge every few winters. There would be 4 days of meals, games, photographs, and loving interrogation. According to Natalie, everyone believed I had been quietly dating the mysterious man from work. I could have corrected them. Any emotionally healthy adult would have corrected them. Instead, when the meeting ended, I followed Julian to the kitchenette. I need to ask you something strange, I said. He poured hot water into a mug. Stranger than making a tooth look emotionally authoritative? Considerably. He leaned against the counter. His dark hair had fallen forward during the meeting, and he pushed it back with his wrist. You have my attention. I explained too quickly. I told him about the video call, the family assumptions, my grandmother's birthday, and the lodge. I emphasized that I knew the reasonable solution was telling the truth. Then I asked whether he would come to Cedar Ridge and pretend to be my boyfriend. Julian stared at me. The office refrigerator hummed behind us. For 4 days, I added. 3 nights, separate rooms, obviously. I'd pay for everything. And you can say no. You should probably say no. You want me to spend Christmas weekend with your entire family? Grandma's birthday weekend. Christmas adjacent. As your boyfriend. A very new boyfriend. No one would expect excessive detail. One corner of his mouth lifted. Have you met families? Unfortunately, yes. I was preparing an apology when he asked, why me? There were safe answers. He was easy to talk to. My family had already seen him. He was good under pressure. All were true. The dangerous answer was that he was the only person I could imagine beside me at that crowded table without feeling more alone. They already think it's you, I said. Something shifted in his face, small enough that I nearly missed it. Right, he said. Of course. That came out badly. It came out honestly. He took a slow drink, studying me over the rim of the mug. When do we leave? I blinked. Is that a yes? It's a request for information. Friday morning. And when would we come back? Tuesday. I can drive. You wouldn't have to do anything except tolerate my relatives and occasionally stand close enough to me that they stop asking questions. Alex. Yes. You are terrible at selling this. I write toothpaste ads. He laughed, then looked through the glass wall toward the office. The humor softened, leaving him thoughtful. My mother and her husband are going to Aruba, he said. My sister is spending the holiday with her wife's family. I was planning to stay home, order something irresponsible, and reorganize my kitchen cabinets. That sounds peaceful. It sounded lonely when I said it out loud. I did not know what to say to that. Julian rarely spoke about his family. I knew his parents had divorced when he was young, and that his sister lived in Boston. I knew he disliked raisins, drove an aging blue Volvo, and could identify almost any typeface from across a room. There were blank spaces around the important parts of him. He set down his mug. All right, I'll do it. You will? On two conditions. First, we agree on the rules before we leave. Absolutely. Second, you do not pay me to attend your grandmother's birthday. I meant expenses. You look like you were about to offer a day rate. Occupational habit. He held out his hand as if we had finished a negotiation. I took it. His palm was warm. The contact lasted perhaps 1 second longer than it needed to, and in that second, my entire bad idea became real. Congratulations, Julian said. You have a boyfriend until Tuesday. 2. Terms and conditions. We wrote the rules Thursday night at a quiet barn near the office. Julian arrived with a black notebook labeled Temporary Romantic FRAUD in neat capital letters. I laughed hard enough that the bartender looked over. We need consistency, he said, opening to the first page. How long have we been dating? 3 months. Too long. They'll ask why you hid me. 6 weeks. Long enough to justify a family trip, short enough to explain why we don't know everything. Good. He wrote it down. First date? That noodle place near the office. You hate that place. Exactly. If I remember to say I liked it because you were there, I'll look romantic. Julian paused with his pen above the paper. That was almost smooth. Put it in the notebook. We built a relationship out of ordinary facts. We had first noticed each other during a campaign pitch. I had asked him for dinner after 6 months of mutual hesitation. He had chosen the restaurant. Our second date had been at the art museum, because that had actually happened as a coworker outing and we could describe it without inventing details. Then we reached physical boundaries. The joking faded. Hand-holding? He asked. Fine. Arm around you? Fine. Same in reverse. Kissing. I looked at the candle between us. Probably unnecessary. Probably is not a rule. He was right. The fact that he was right irritated me because it required me to imagine kissing him with administrative precision. Only if one of us asks first, I said, and the other person can say no without explaining. He wrote it down. Good. What about an exit signal? If either of us says invoice, we leave the conversation. Why invoice? Because no one wants to continue a conversation after hearing it. We agreed not to invent tragedies, medical conditions, or promises about the future. We would not use private information the other person had shared at work. If either of us became uncomfortable, the performance stopped. If my family discovered the truth, I would take responsibility. One more, Julian said. What? No treating me like an employee. You aren't my employee. You get bossy when you're nervous. I do not. He raised his eyebrows. Fine, no bossing. We drank 1 beer each and spent the next hour practicing details no sensible couple would rehearse. His favorite movie was The Apartment. Mine was Jaws, which he said explained several things about me but refused to specify what they were. He slept on the left side of the bed. I slept diagonally and denied it. He liked his coffee black. I liked mine disguised as dessert. What do you like about me? He asked. I nearly dropped a pretzel. They'll ask, he said. Will they? Your aunt tried to introduce you to an orthodontist in a supermarket. She'll ask. I considered giving him a clever answer. Instead, I looked at his notebook, at the careful block letters and the small cartoon tooth he had drawn in the corner. You make people feel less embarrassed about needing help, I said. Julian stopped moving. I continued, because silence made me reckless. At work, I mean. You never announce that you're saving someone. You just make the problem smaller until they can handle it. His expression changed in a way I could not name. That's what you're going with. Unless you pre-furnish shoulders. My shoulders are excellent. They're acceptable. He wrote something in the notebook, shielding the page with his hand. What did you write? Classified information. That violates our transparency policy. We don't have one. Add it. He closed the notebook. Your turn. Ask me. I knew what he meant, but hearing the question suddenly felt dangerous. What do you like about me? Julian did not look away. You pay attention when you think no one notices. I waited for a punchline. None came. That sounds vague, I said. You know everyone's lunch order. You rewrite emails for interns who are scared of sounding stupid. When Mara's presentation crashed, you distracted the client while she fixed it. You act cynical because it lets you be kind without anyone thanking you. The bar seemed quieter than it had a moment earlier. You prepared that, I said. I didn't. It sounded prepared. Maybe I've had time to notice. He glanced at his watch and signaled for the check. The moment closed before I could decide whether to open it further. Outside, the air was sharp and cold. We stood beneath the bar's striped awning while light snow moved through the street lamps. 9 tomorrow? I asked. I'll be ready. You can still change your mind. So can you. I should have. Instead, I watched him walk toward the subway with his hands in his coat pockets and wondered when he had found enough time to notice me. 3. The drive north. Julian packed like a person expecting both an avalanche and a formal dinner. He brought one small suitcase, a garment bag, emergency blankets, tire chains, a first aid kit, and a wrapped gift for my grandmother. You bought her something? I asked as he arranged everything in my trunk. I'm her grandson's boyfriend. Arriving empty-handed would damage the brand. Temporary boyfriend. He looked at me over the trunk lid. Do you plan to correct your grandmother every time she uses the title? No. Then let me commit to the role. The drive to Cedar Ridge took 5 hours without weather and nearly 7 with it. Snow dusted the highway's shoulders as the city thinned into small towns and bare hills. My mother called before we had crossed the county line. Put her on speaker, Julian said. That seems reckless. We need field practice. I answered. My mother's voice filled the car. Are you on the road? Is Julian with you? How is the weather? Did you bring boots? Good morning to you too, Mom. Julian leaned toward the phone. Good morning, Mrs. Mercer. He brought boots, I checked. There was a delighted silence. Call me Denise, she said. Anyone who gets Alex to prepare for weather has earned it. I prepare for weather. You wore canvas shoes during the flood of 2018. It wasn't a flood when I left home. Julian covered a smile with his hand. My mother gave us directions we already had, warned us about a steep section near the lodge, and said everyone was excited to meet him. When the call ended, I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "She likes you," I said. "I have spoken 12 words." That was enough. You brought boots. For the first hour, we stayed on safe subjects: traffic, work, music, whether the office holiday party counted as paid suffering. Gradually, the conversation loosened. Julian told me he'd grown up outside Pittsburgh. His father had owned a print shop and taught him to recognize color differences so small that, as a child, he assumed everyone could see them. "Is that why you became an art director?" I asked. "Partly. I liked that design could make information feel possible." That sounds suspiciously sincere. "Don't tell anyone at work." His father had died 6 years earlier. Julian said it simply, without asking me to respond in any particular way. His mother remarried the following year and began spending holidays abroad. His sister always invited him to Boston, but her wife had a huge family and their house was crowded. "I like them," he said. "I just feel like an additional chair someone has to find." I understood more than I wanted to. Andrew had once described my family gatherings as exhausting because everyone talked at the same time and no one respected personal space. He had not been entirely wrong. Still, after we separated, the family group chat had become evidence that somewhere I remained expected. "You won't be an additional chair," I said. "My mother probably made a place card." That's reassuring and terrifying. At a rest stop 2 hours later, we bought coffee and traded driving. When I returned from the restroom, I saw Julian helping an older man clear snow from the windshield of a compact car. He did it without taking off his wool coat and without accepting the cash the man tried to offer. I stood under the gas station canopy holding 2 cups and felt the first quiet crack in the story I had been telling myself. I had believed I chose Julian because he was convenient. He was single, my family had seen him, and we worked well together. But convenience did not explain why I knew the shape of his hands from across a parking lot. It did not explain why his praise at the bar had followed me into sleep. When he returned, his shoulders were speckled with snow. "Your coffee," I said. "Thanks. You know you're allowed to walk past problems that aren't yours." He glanced back at the older man, who was pulling carefully onto the road. "I know." "Do you?" Julian looked at me for a beat too long. "Do you?" We drove the final miles in a silence that was not uncomfortable, only full. Near Cedar Ridge, the highway narrowed and climbed through thick pine forest. Snow gathered on the branches. Wooden signs advertised sleigh rides, handmade candles, and something called authentic mountain fudge. The town appeared around a bend. Brick storefronts, strings of warm lights, a clock tower, and steep white roofs against the darkening sky. My family's lodge stood above town at the end of a winding road. It was a broad cedar house with stone chimneys and a porch wrapped in yellow bulbs. 3 cars already crowded the drive. Before I turned in, Julian touched my arm. "Last chance," he said. "For you or me?" "Both." I looked at the house. Through the windows, figures moved past the tree. My mother would be waiting inside. Natalie would have questions. Aunt Louise would have more questions. My grandmother would look at me with the gentle, unsettling attention of someone who had known me before I learned to hide. Then I looked at Julian. "Invoice," I said. His eyes widened. "I'm practicing," I added. He exhaled a laugh. "You're an idiot." "A prepared idiot." He held out his hand between the seats. "Ready?" I took it. Ready? 4. 1 bed, several witnesses. My mother opened the front door before we reached it. She hugged me first, then turned to Julian with enough restraint to ask, "Are you comfortable with hugs?" "Yes," he said, and she folded him into the family as if she had been waiting months to do it. The entryway filled quickly. My father, Martin, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. Natalie came down the stairs with her phone already raised. Aunt Louise called from the living room that she wanted a proper introduction, not hallway shouting. My grandmother remained in her armchair beside the fireplace, smiling as the noise came toward her. Julian squeezed my hand once. It looked like reassurance for the performance. It felt like reassurance for me. I introduced him to everyone. He remembered every name. He complimented my father on the smell coming from the kitchen, asked Natalie about the graduate program I had mentioned in the car, and presented my grandmother with his gift. "You didn't need to bring me anything," she said. "Alex told me you collect old postcards." I had told him that during our rules meeting, in a list of details I assumed no one would retain, Julian had found a framed postcard of Cedar Ridge from 1954, the year my grandmother was born. She touched the glass with one finger. "Where did you find this?" "A shop near my apartment. The owner said the stamp is original, but I cannot personally verify that." Then we'll choose to believe him. Some things are nicer before they're verified. Her eyes moved from Julian to me. I suddenly wondered whether she was discussing the postcard. The lodge had 6 bedrooms. There were 12 family members, 1 toddler, and according to my mother, a tiny administrative complication. "The downstairs radiator leaked," she explained as she led us upstairs. "Your aunt and uncle had to move into the twin room. Natalie and Priya have the small room because the crib fits there. Your father and I are in the back. Grandma can't use the stairs, so you two have the blue room." She opened the door. The blue room contained 1 large bed. Julian stood behind me. I could feel the silence he was making. "We can take the sofa," I said. "Absolutely not," my mother replied. "You're adults. Also, the sofa has a metal bar that permanently altered your uncle's posture." "I could ask the hotel in town," Julian offered. My mother's face fell so quickly he reversed course in the same breath. "But this is perfect," he said. "Thank you." She brightened. "Dinner in 40 minutes. The door closed behind her. We stared at the bed. It was wide, neatly made, and covered by a blue quilt patterned with white stars. A carved wooden sign above it read, "ALLYOUNEEDISLOVEAND, a CABIN, which felt less like decoration than surveillance. "I'll sleep on the floor," I said. "No. You're doing me a favor," which does not require spinal damage. Julian set his suitcase beside the dresser. "We're adults. The bed is enormous." "I sleep diagonally. I'll establish a border." He took the decorative pillows and arranged them in a line down the center of the mattress. "International territory," he said. "What happens if I cross it?" "Sanctions." I laughed, and some of the tension left the room. We unpacked. Julian hung 2 shirts and a dark green sweater in the closet. I folded nothing and pushed my suitcase beneath a chair. He watched me do it with visible concern. "This is why your clothes wrinkle." "My clothes wrinkle because fabric is weak." There was a knock. Natalie entered without waiting for permission, took one look at the pillow border, and smiled. "Trouble in paradise?" she asked. "Julian snores," I said. "Alex steals blankets," Julian said at the same time. Natalie's smile widened. "You two are adorable." After she left, Julian pointed at me. "We need a unified strategy. You do snore. You've never heard me sleep." Method acting. At dinner, Julian sat between me and my grandmother. My father served beef stew, and Aunt Louise began her investigation before everyone had bread. So who asked whom out? "Alex asked me," Julian said. I turned toward him. We had agreed on that detail, but the confidence in his voice made it sound remembered. "Finally," Natalie said. "He talked about you for months." I did not. "You called him the only art director who understands words. In Alex's language, that's practically a sonnet." Julian's knee touched mine beneath the table. He did not move it away. "He waited until we finished a terrible client presentation," Julian said. "Then he asked whether I wanted to get noodles." "Romantic," my father said. "They were very bad noodles," I explained. "But good company," Julian added. The table reacted with a collective sound of approval. I looked down at my bowl, aware of the warmth climbing my face. My grandmother asked Julian about his work. Unlike the others, she did not ask about us. She listened while he described designing public service posters for a local clinic, then told him about the print shop where she had worked in college. They compared ink stains. Within 10 minutes, They had constructed a world that did not require me. I should have been relieved. Instead, I felt strangely protective of the place he was making at the table. After dinner, everyone carried dishes to the kitchen. My father tried to refuse Julian's help. Julian ignored him politely and began washing pans. He asked where things belonged rather than pretending to know. When my uncle missed a joke because his hearing aid battery had died, Julian repeated it without drawing attention to the interruption. I watched him move among my family with the ease of someone who had been invited for himself. Natalie came to stand beside me. "You look happy," she said. "I'm watching him wash a pot." "Exactly. Don't make it strange." "I'm not making anything." Her voice softened. "You haven't brought anyone home since Andrew." Across the kitchen, Julian looked up. His eyes found mine immediately. I had expected the lie to feel like something I carried alone. But every time Julian reached for my hand or smiled at me across a room, he lifted half its weight. That made it easier. It also made it far more dangerous. 5. The photograph. That night, the pillow border lasted 12 minutes. Not because anything happened. The room was cold, and Julian discovered that decorative pillows were terrible insulation. He moved them to the floor while I brushed my teeth, then climbed beneath the quilt wearing a gray t-shirt and plaid sleep pants. I changed in the bathroom and returned with all the confidence of a man approaching a live electrical wire. "You can relax," he said, opening his book. "I signed the treaty." I am relaxed. You're standing at attention. I got into bed and left an ocean of mattress between us. We read in silence, or Julian read. I stared at the same page for 10 minutes while noticing details that had no professional relevance. The shadow of his lashes, the line of concentration between his eyebrows, the soft sound he made when a sentence amused him. "What?" he asked without looking up. "Nothing." "You've turned one page since we got in. It's dense." He glanced at the cover. "It's a mystery novel from the airport. Very dense murder." He switched off his lamp. "Good night, boyfriend." The word settled somewhere beneath my ribs. Good night. I woke before dawn with my hand resting in the empty space between us. Julian was asleep on his side, facing me. We were not touching. In the blue light from the window, he looked younger and less guarded. I withdrew my hand carefully and told myself the disappointment I felt was relief. By breakfast, the lodge had become organized chaos. My mother needed the birthday cake collected from town. Natalie wanted everyone at the winter market for a family photograph. My father had misplaced a bag of coffee while holding it. Julian moved through the noise with the calm of an air traffic controller. He found the coffee. He fixed the strap on the diaper bag. He handed me a plate before I realized I had forgotten to eat. "You don't have to solve everything," I told him quietly. "I'm enjoying myself." "You enjoy locating groceries?" "I enjoy being useful in a house where people seem glad I'm here." The answer was so direct that I had no defense against it. We walked into Cedar Ridge just before noon. The winter market filled the central square with wooden stalls, evergreen garlands, and strings of lights that remained bright under the gray sky. Children chased each other between adults carrying paper cups. A brass quartet played holiday songs beside the clock tower, occasionally disagreeing about the key. Julian wore the green sweater from his suitcase. Snow caught in his dark hair. When my mother asked us to stand together for a photograph, he slipped an arm around my waist as naturally as if he had done it 100 times. My body forgot the arrangement was fictional. "Closer," Natalie called from behind the phone. Julian's hand tightened slightly at my side. I leaned into him. His cheek brushed my temple. "You okay?" he murmured. "Yes." "You're holding your breath." "It's cold." "Of course." The camera captured the exact moment I started laughing. We split into smaller groups after that. My parents took my grandmother to look at pottery. Natalie and Priya went in search of something their toddler could not break. Julian and I were assigned to collect the birthday cake from a bakery 2 streets away. "Your family has stopped supervising us," he said as we walked. "That means we've passed the first inspection." What is the second? Aunt Louise asks where we see ourselves in 5 years. Do we have an answer? Witness protection. The bakery was crowded, so we waited outside beneath a red canvas awning. Across the street, a store displayed wooden ornaments in its windows. Julian watched a father lift his daughter so she could hang a paper wish on a public tree. Did your family always do trips like this? He asked. Not always. After my grandfather died, Grandma stopped celebrating her birthday. Mom started the Cedar Ridge weekends to trick her into it. Did it work? Eventually. Grandma complained for 2 years, then became responsible for the schedule. He smiled. I like her. She likes you. How can you tell? She didn't challenge your postcard story. That was a true story. Exactly. She challenges everyone else. The bakery door opened, releasing warm air scented with cinnamon. A woman stepped out, looked at me, and called my name. It took me a second to recognize her. Rachel Kim had been 1 year ahead of me in high school and knew enough about my history to become dangerous without intending to. We hugged. She asked about work, the city, my parents. Then she looked at Julian. This is my boyfriend, I said. The word came faster than thought. Julian offered his hand. Julian. Rachel's eyes flicked between us. Nice to meet you. I'm glad somebody finally convinced Alex to come back here. He didn't mention much convincing, Julian said. That sounds like him. She did not expose us. She only smiled at me in a way that said she had questions for another time. After she left, I realized I still had my hand on Julian's back. You didn't hesitate, he said. We had an audience. Right. The bakery called our number. We collected a chocolate cake decorated with tiny white mountains and carried it between us through the crowd. At the public wish tree, Julian stopped. Blank paper tags hung from a basket. I watched him write something, fold it once, and tie it to a high branch. What did you wish for? I asked. If I tell you, the temporary romantic fraud department revokes it. That is not how wishes work. You write toothpaste ads. Are you also an authority on magic? I took a tag. After a moment, I wrote, Let me not ruin what is good, because I am afraid to name it. Then I folded the words where no one could see them and hung the tag beside his. On the way back to the square, snow began to fall in large, slow flakes. Julian shifted the cake box to one hand and held out the other. There was no family nearby. No one to convince. I took it anyway. 6. What was real? The birthday dinner was scheduled for the next evening, but my family treated the entire weekend as a celebration. That afternoon, we played a card game my grandmother had owned since 1979. Julian learned the rules faster than anyone explained them, and then deliberately lost to my 3-year-old niece, who was not technically playing. My father liked him because Julian asked about the old motorcycle photographs in the hallway. My mother liked him because he noticed when she was doing too much and took a tray from her hands without making a speech. Aunt Louise liked him because he answered personal questions with enough charm to make her believe she had received information. I liked him for reasons that were becoming difficult to list without admitting the obvious. In the early evening, my grandmother asked us to help retrieve a box of photographs from the attic. The staircase was narrow, and the single bulb at the top cast a weak yellow circle. Julian climbed first. I followed close enough to see a small scar at the base of his neck, disappearing beneath his sweater. The attic smelled of cedar and dust. We found 3 boxes marked Mercer family and carried them toward the light. Your mother said 1 box, Julian said. My mother believes all storage spaces are magical. We sat on the floor to search. Most of the photographs were unsorted. School portraits, vacations, birthdays, my parents before they had sensible haircuts. Julian found a picture of me at 14, wearing braces and a red velvet jacket 2 sizes too large. I'm keeping this, he said. That is theft. Evidence. Of what? Resilience. I tried to take it. He held it above his head, and we ended up half wrestling, half laughing in the dust. I reached across him. His free hand landed at my waist. We stopped. The attic seemed to shrink around us. His face was close enough that I saw a pale ring around his brown irises. Alex, he said. My name sounded like a question. Footsteps struck the stairs below. We separated so quickly that Julian bumped his shoulder against a trunk. Natalie appeared carrying 2 mugs. She looked from me to Julian, then to the photograph still raised in his hand. Am I interrupting a crime? She asked. He's stealing family property. It's a picture of you in the velvet jacket, isn't it? Julian lowered it. You knew? We all have copies. That evening, after everyone went to bed, I found Julian alone in the kitchen washing 2 glasses. The lights above the stove were the only ones on. Wind moved softly around the lodge. You know we have a dishwasher, I said. Your mother filled it with serving platters. I dried the glass he handed me. For a while we worked without speaking. About the attic, I began. We almost fell onto a box of tax records. That's not what I meant. I know. He shut off the water. Our shoulders nearly touched. Did you want to kiss me? I asked. The question was barely audible. Julian looked at me. That is not a useful question if you don't know what answer you want. I want the true one. Yes. The honesty landed harder than flirtation would have. I set down the towel. Because of the situation. No. Because we've been acting like... No. He spoke gently, but he did not let me hide inside the explanation. I wanted to kiss you before this trip. I stared at him. Why did you agree to come? I asked. At first, because I had nowhere I wanted to be, and you were asking me to be somewhere. He leaned back against the counter. But I also thought 4 days with you might help me stop wondering. Wondering what? Whether the way you looked at me meant anything. All my rehearsed caution disappeared. What way? He gave a quiet, disbelieving laugh. Like that. I looked down. The tiled floor blurred for a second, not with tears, but with the force of being seen. You don't have to answer tonight, he said. I'm not asking you to change the agreement. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you not to tell me every real moment is part of the act. I thought of his hand at the market, offered when no one was watching. I thought of waking with my palm in the space between us. I thought of the wish I had hidden in folded paper. It isn't all an act, I said. Julian stepped closer, slowly enough that I could move away. He raised one hand and rested his fingers against my jaw. May I kiss you? Our rule, a clear question, a choice that belonged entirely to me. Fear rose first. Not fear of him, but of what would exist after I said yes. Then I heard myself answer, yes. He kissed me softly. There was no dramatic collision, no music, no sudden certainty about the rest of our lives. His thumb moved once against my cheek. My hand found the front of his sweater. The kiss deepened only slightly, enough to make the room feel warmer. When we separated, he stayed close. Still okay? He asked. Yes. I kissed him again because I wanted one decision I did not immediately analyze. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. We stepped apart, smiling like guilty teenagers despite being nearly 30. No one entered. Julian touched his forehead to mine. We should sleep. That seems unlikely now. In the blue room, we removed the pillow border without discussing it. We lay on our backs, close but not touching. Julian? Yes? What happens Tuesday? He was quiet for so long that I wondered if he had fallen asleep. Tuesday is not tonight, he finally said. It was not an answer. I accepted it because I did not yet have one either. In the darkness, his hand moved across the quilt until it found mine. We fell asleep holding on. 7, the story he told. The next morning, I woke with my head on Julian's shoulder and his arm around me. For one peaceful second, I forgot the rules, the family, and the date printed on the return reservation. I only knew that someone warm was breathing beneath my cheek. Then Julian opened his eyes. Border violation, he said, his voice rough with sleep. I lifted my head. You crossed it. There is no border. You removed it. Shared liability. Neither of us moved away. A knock sounded at the door, followed immediately by my mother's voice. Breakfast in 20 minutes. Also, you two look beautiful in that market photo. We looked at each other. How does she know what we look like right now? Julian whispered. Mother's see-through walls. Downstairs, the photograph had already become the background image on my mother's tablet. In it, snow fell around us as Julian held me close. My face was turned toward him, unguarded and bright. I did look happy. That frightened me more than the lie. The day passed in preparations for my grandmother's dinner. My father cooked. Natalie assembled a slideshow. Aunt Louise arranged flowers and rearranged everyone else. Julian volunteered to help my grandmother choose photographs for the program. I heard them talking in the living room while I taped paper decorations in the hall. Tell me how you met, my grandmother said. I nearly dropped the tape. We had practiced this. At work, Julian replied. That's geography, not a story. He laughed. We were on the same campaign. I noticed him before he noticed me. I stopped moving. What did you notice? She asked. He was presenting an idea he didn't believe in because the person whose idea had failed was too nervous to speak. He made it sound good enough that no one blamed her. That had happened 8 months earlier. I remembered the room, the client's blank expressions, and the panic on our intern's face. I did not remember Julian watching. When did he notice you? My grandmother asked. You'd have to ask him. I will. I'm sure he'll enjoy that. His voice was playful, but the story had not been invented. It was more intimate than our noodles, more dangerous than the museum. He had given my grandmother a true beginning inside a false relationship. At the birthday dinner, the long table glowed with candles. My grandmother wore a navy dress and the silver earrings my grandfather had given her decades earlier. Julian sat at my side. His knee touched mine beneath the table, just as it had the first night. But now, the contact carried the memory of the kitchen. My father made a short speech. Natalie played the slideshow. Photographs moved across the television. Grandma as a child, Grandma in college, Grandma and my grandfather standing beside their first car, Grandma holding me as a baby with an expression that suggested she was already worried about my decisions. At the final image, everyone raised a glass. My grandmother thanked us, then said she wanted music. My father connected his phone to a small speaker. The living room became a dance floor made of rugs pushed aside and furniture moved badly. My parents danced first. Natalie pulled Priya into the center. Aunt Louise ordered my uncle to improve his posture. Julian held out his hand. This was not in the contract, I said. Page 4, public displays of competence. I have no competence. Then I'll lead. He drew me into the room. We moved slowly, more swaying than dancing. His hand rested between my shoulder blades. Mine settled at his waist. Everyone is watching, I whispered. Only because you look terrified. I hate dancing. You hate being observed. He was right. I looked toward the family. My mother was smiling. Natalie leaned against Priya. My grandmother watched us with an expression I could not read. Look at me, Julian said. I did. The room receded. His face was close, his gaze steady. We moved through one song and into the next without stopping. May I? He asked quietly. I knew what he meant. Yes. He kissed me in front of everyone. It was brief and gentle. The family applauded anyway. I laughed against his cheek, embarrassed and happy, and suddenly unable to distinguish those feelings from grief. Because Tuesday existed. Because the office existed. Because I had built a temporary structure around something that had already become real. When the song ended, I stepped away too quickly. I need air, I said. I went onto the back porch without my coat. Snow covered the railing. Cold caught at my lungs. The door opened behind me. Julian placed my coat over my shoulders. What happened? He asked. Nothing. That's not true. It was a lot of attention. Use the word if you need to leave. Invoice. His face went still. The exit signal had been designed for Aunt Louise, crowded rooms, and questions we could not answer. I had just used it on him. "Okay," he said. He went inside and closed the door softly. I stood alone on the porch, wearing the coat he had remembered when I had not, and hated myself for feeling relieved. Temporary. Julian was polite the next morning. Politeness had never felt so much like distance. He asked whether I wanted coffee. He moved aside when I entered the bathroom. At breakfast, he laughed at my uncle's story and passed me the butter without letting our fingers touch. To my family, we looked like a comfortable couple recovering from a late night. To me, every careful inch between us was an accusation. I tried twice to speak with him. Both times, someone interrupted. My mother needed boxes carried to the car. Natalie wanted help dressing my niece. My father had found a suspicious noise in the furnace and believed Julian's design degree might qualify him to diagnose it. By noon, I had convinced myself space was good. We were returning home the next day. The arrangement had an ending, and endings were safer when everyone remembered them. That was what I told Natalie when she found me alone in the laundry room, pretending to examine a shelf of detergent. "Did you two fight?" she asked. "No." "You're hiding beside fabric softener." "I'm reading the label." "You have never read a label in your life." I crossed my arms. "We're fine." "Julian looks like someone canceled a flight he wasn't sure he wanted to take." "That is extremely specific." "Priya says I'm emotionally observant." "Priya loves you." "Exactly. Qualified source." Natalie leaned against the washing machine. "He is not Andrew." The name landed where she intended it to. I know. "Do you? Because you act like liking someone is the first step in a disaster plan." "You don't know what is happening." "Then tell me." For one reckless second, I almost did. I almost told her the entire humiliating truth. The lie, the notebook, the rules, the kitchen kiss, the word I had used to send him away. Instead, I said, "It's new." New things are allowed to matter. She left before I could answer. That afternoon, the family divided again. Most went on a short hike near the lodge. My grandmother stayed behind to rest. Julian offered to remain with her. "I'll stay too," I said. "You should go," he replied. "Your father planned the route." His tone was pleasant. Final. I went because refusing would have created questions. For 2 hours, I walked through snowy woods while replaying every choice that had brought us there. The path climbed toward an overlook above the town. From the ridge, Cedar Ridge looked small and orderly. Smoke rising from chimneys, streets crossing at sensible angles. My feelings did not look like that. They looked like the footprints behind us, overlapping until I could not tell which were mine. When we returned, Julian was in the blue room packing. "We leave tomorrow," I said from the doorway. "I know." He folded the green sweater and placed it in his suitcase. "Can we talk?" He sat on the edge of the bed. "Yes." I closed the door. All day I had constructed careful sentences. None survived his attention. "I'm sorry about last night," I said. "For needing air?" "For using the word on you." "You were allowed to." "That doesn't mean it didn't hurt you." He looked down at his hands. "No, it doesn't." I panicked. I noticed. The kiss felt real. It was real to me. There it was again. Truth, offered without decoration. "That's what scared me," I admitted. He nodded once. "And what do you want now?" I wanted him to close the distance. I wanted Tuesday to become an ordinary day instead of a deadline. I wanted to return to the moment before I heard him and choose differently. But wanting was not the same as trusting. Andrew had taught me how quickly affection could become a list of my deficiencies. I knew that was unfair to Julian. Fear was often unfair. It remained persuasive. "I don't know," I said. Pain crossed his face before he controlled it. "Then we should return to the original plan," he said. "We finish the weekend. We go home. At work, nothing changes." "Is that what you want?" "No." He zipped the suitcase. "But you asked me not to turn every real moment into part of the act. I'm asking you not to turn my feelings into a waiting room. He left before I could answer. On the bed, the old photograph of me in the red velvet jacket lay beside my pillow. He had not stolen it after all. 9. The part we had not rehearsed. Dinner that evening was leftovers served in mismatched bowls. Everyone was tired, and the lodge had settled into the softer mood that comes at the end of a family trip. Suitcases appeared near doors. My mother distributed containers of food no one had requested. My father checked the weather every 15 minutes. Julian sat across from me instead of beside me. No one commented, but my grandmother noticed. She noticed everything. After dinner, my mother announced that snow had closed the lower mountain road until morning. This changed none of our plans, but it gave the family an excuse to open another bottle of wine and begin a game of charades. Julian played. He laughed. He performed an excellent impression of a washing machine. If someone had watched him without knowing him, they would have assumed he was happy. I knew better now. When the game ended, I found him on the front porch with his coat buttoned to his throat. Snow had stopped. The air was clear, and the lights of Cedar Ridge shone below us. I won't keep you long, I said. You don't have to ask permission to stand on your family's porch. I'm not asking about the porch. He looked toward the town. I stood at the other end of the railing, leaving space between us. When Andrew left, he said I made every feeling his responsibility. If I was worried, he had to fix it. If I was insecure, he had to prove something. By the end, I couldn't tell whether I was asking for love or asking him to manage me. Julian stayed silent. So I decided the solution was not to need anything. I know that isn't fair to you. I know you aren't him. But last night, everyone looked at us like we were already a complete story, and I could suddenly see how much losing it would hurt. You ended it before it could end. I tried to. That may feel safer from inside your head, Alex. From outside, it still feels like being left. I absorbed that without defending myself. I'm sorry, I said, not as a way to make you tell me it's fine. It isn't fine. I hurt you. His shoulders lowered slightly. Thank you, he said. It was not forgiveness. It was an opening. I don't know how to promise you I'll never panic again, I continued. I probably will, but I can promise not to punish you for it. I can tell you when I'm afraid instead of pretending I feel nothing. Julian finally looked at me. Are you offering friendship? No. Then say what you're offering. The old instinct told me to be clever. Cleverness had protected me all weekend and brought me exactly here. A real first date, I said. One where my family is not upstairs and no one is grading our performance. I'm offering an honest attempt. Slowly, if you're willing. He studied my face. And if you decide you aren't ready, I tell you, I don't disappear behind a joke or a rule. And work. We're peers. We follow the agency policy, ask for separate accounts if we need them, and behave like adults. Ambitious. I've been told I'm excellent at ambitious fiction. His mouth almost curved, but he looked away again. I need time, he said. Disappointment moved through me, sharp and deserved. Okay. This was the part we had not rehearsed, wanting something without controlling the answer. I went inside alone. 10. My grandmother's question. I slept badly. Julian came to bed after midnight and stayed on his side. No pillow border returned, but the empty space between us felt wider than before. In the morning, I found my grandmother at the kitchen table before anyone else was awake. She was drinking tea and sorting the photographs we had brought down from the attic. Sit, she said. It was not phrased as a request. I sat across from her. She placed the photograph of 14-year-old me between us. Julian found this, she said. I know. He asked whether he could have a copy. Something tightened in my chest. When? Yesterday afternoon. She returned the picture to the stack. You told us a story because you thought the truth would disappoint us. I looked up sharply. I raised your mother, she continued. Do you think I cannot recognize family panic? How long have you known? Known? I still don't know. But real couples do not watch each other as carefully as you two did on the first night. You were learning the rules. I covered my face with both hands. I am so sorry. I am not the person who needs that apology most. I already apologized to him. That is not the same as deciding what you will do next. I asked him for a real date. He said he needs time. Then give him time. That's all. No, while you wait, stop rehearsing the rejection. It wastes the time too. I lowered my hands. She stirred her tea. Your grandfather asked me to dance 4 times before I said yes, not because I disliked him. I wanted to know whether he could hear no without becoming cruel. Could he? The first 3 times, he said, maybe another song. On the 4th, I said yes before he finished asking. Is this advice to ask Julian 3 more times? Absolutely not. My advice is to let him have his answer until he changes it. That sounded like my grandmother, romantic, practical, and unwilling to let a story excuse bad behavior. Voices moved upstairs. The house began waking. Are you angry? I asked. A little. Your mother will be angrier because she changed the sheets. I laughed despite myself. Grandma reached across the table and pressed my wrist. The beginning may have been invented. That does not make every moment after it false. Just do not keep lying because the truth arrived late. 11. A real first date. The road reopened at 10. Cars were packed, leftovers assigned, and rooms checked for abandoned chargers. I carried our suitcases to the trunk while Julian said goodbye to my family. My mother hugged him for a long time. My father told him he expected help with the motorcycle next year. Natalie whispered something that made him glance toward me. My grandmother handed him an envelope containing the copy of my velvet jacket photograph. For resilience, she said. Julian looked from the photograph to me. Thank you. We began the drive in silence. I kept both hands on the wheel and did not fill the space with apologies. Cedar Ridge disappeared behind the trees. 20 minutes later, Julian said, pull over at the market. The stalls were closed, but the public wish tree still stood in the square. Snow covered its branches, and hundreds of folded tags moved in the wind. We walked toward it. Our wishes were impossible to identify among the others. Mine said I wanted a place I didn't have to earn, Julian said. I turned toward him. All weekend, your family made room for me before I did anything useful. I kept doing things anyway because I didn't know how to trust that the room would remain. You don't have to earn a place with me. I know you mean that, but we both have habits that sound reasonable until they hurt someone. Then we should probably not promise to become different people overnight. No, he put his hands in his coat pockets. We could promise to point out the habits before they drive the car. Is that a yes? It is a request for information. The answer echoed our office kitchenette, and hope rose carefully inside me. Friday night, I said. Dinner at the noodle place. The terrible one. We need to reclaim our fictional history. And after dinner. The art museum is open late. You've planned this since approximately 3 this morning. He stepped closer. One date, then we decide about another. One date. No family audience. Agreed. No pretending not to be scared. I swallowed. Agreed. May I kiss you? There was no one in the square except a vendor clearing snow from a cart. No performance remained. Yes, I said. Julian kissed me beneath the wish tree. It was warmer and surer than the kiss in the kitchen. Not because our future was settled, but because neither of us was borrowing the moment from a lie. When we separated, he kept one hand at the back of my neck. We have to tell your family, he said. I know. Together. You still want to be there? I want to choose how the story ends. We returned to the lodge. My mother opened the door with immediate alarm. What happened? Is the road closed again? No, I said. We need to tell everyone something. 10 minutes later, my family sat in the living room wearing coats and expressions normally reserved for medical announcements. Julian sat beside me. This time, I did not reach for his hand until he turned his palm upward. I told them the truth. I explained the careless comment, the invitation, and the agreement. I did not call it a joke or blame their questions. I apologized for using their trust as scenery. My mother stared at me. My father rubbed his forehead. Aunt Louise looked personally betrayed by the loss of 6 weeks of relationship history. Natalie said, "I knew something was weird." "You said we were adorable," I reminded her. "Both things can be true." Then I told them the second truth. "We weren't together when we arrived," I said. "We are not exactly together now. We have one real date scheduled. We want to see what happens without pretending." My mother looked at Julian. "Are you all right?" The question mattered. She was not asking whether the story still gave her the ending she wanted. "I am," he said. "I agreed to the plan. The new part is my choice, too." My father released a long breath. "I'm too old for modern courtship." "This is not modern," Grandma said. "People have been making foolish romantic decisions forever." Aunt Louise raised her hand as if attending a lecture. "Does this mean I cannot ask where you see yourselves in 5 years?" "Correct," Julian and I said together. Laughter moved through the room, breaking the tension without erasing it. My mother remained annoyed. She was entitled to be. "She also made us take the leftover cake." At the door, my grandmother hugged Julian and then me. "I like the first story," she said, "but the revision has better characters." On the highway, Julian opened the temporary romantic FRAUD notebook. Beneath our rules, he had written one private line at the bar. "Maybe I've had time to notice." He crossed out the word temporary. Then he handed me the pen. I wrote our first real plan beneath it. Friday. Bad noodles, no performance. 12. The return. 11 months later, we drove back to Cedar Ridge for my grandmother's 76th birthday. The year between those trips was not a perfect montage. Our first date was awkward for 20 minutes because we already knew too much and not enough. Our second date was better. On our fifth, I asked whether Julian was losing interest because he had taken 3 hours to answer a message. He told me he had been in a movie, then reminded me that reassurance was allowed when I asked for it, instead of demanding that he guess. We argued about work, dishes, and the correct number of pillows for a bed. We requested different client accounts after realizing that bringing campaign disagreements home made both of us unbearable. Julian met my therapist once in the waiting room and charmed her receptionist. I met his sister in Boston and learned he became competitive around board games and lied shamelessly about the rules. Nothing about us became effortless. It became trustworthy. On difficult days, I still reached for old defenses. I made jokes when I wanted comfort, and Julian volunteered solutions when I only wanted him to listen. The difference was that we learned to stop and translate. I could say, "I am worried and I need you near me," without treating the request as a weakness. He could say, "I cannot fix this tonight, but I am not leaving." Those sentences were less dramatic than the promises people made in movies, yet they changed the shape of our home. Love became visible in groceries remembered, apologies completed, quiet mornings, and the freedom to have a bad hour without believing it meant the end of everything together. When we reached the lodge, my mother waited on the porch. She hugged Julian first to punish me. Inside, his place card stood at the table before he carried a single bag or fixed a single problem. He noticed it. So did I. The blue room still had one bed and the same ridiculous wooden sign. Julian set our suitcase beneath the chair while I unfolded our clothes properly, a skill he claimed was his greatest influence on my life. That evening, we walked into town alone. The winter market had returned, brighter and more crowded than I remembered. At the public tree, we each wrote a new wish. Mine was short, "Let me keep choosing what is real." I did not ask Julian what he wrote. Some private hopes could exist without becoming secrets. Back at the lodge, Natalie arranged everyone beneath the porch lights for a photograph. Julian stood beside me. No one told us to move closer. He slipped his arm around my waist anyway. "Ready?" he asked. It was the same question he had asked in the car 1 year earlier, when we were about to enter a house carrying rules for a relationship that did not exist. This time I understood readiness differently. It was not certainty. It was the willingness to arrive without a script, to speak before fear spoke for me, and to let someone love me without turning that love into evidence for a trial. "Ready," I said. The camera flashed. In the photograph, snow rested on Julian's hair. My grandmother laughed in the front row. My mother had one hand raised because she was still giving instructions. Everyone looked slightly cold and completely themselves. Julian turned and kissed my temple just after the picture was taken. The best moment was not captured. For once, I did not need it to be.